By late 1944, Allied forces had broken out from Normandy, liberated much of France, and pushed to the borders of Germany. Many soldiers believed the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. Along a supposedly quiet sector in the Ardennes, American units were thinly spread. Many GIs were newly arrived or recovering from earlier battles, short on rest and winter gear. Inside Germany, the army was under crushing pressure. Allied bombing, Soviet advances from the east, and losses on all fronts convinced many commanders that the war could no longer be won, only delayed. Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. Convinced that only a bold strike could restore Germany's fortunes, he demanded a plan to split the Allied armies and force them into negotiations. Winter, long supply lines and damaged infrastructure strained both sides. Fuel, ammunition, and warm clothing were precious, especially for German units facing shortages. The Ardennes region was hilly, forested, and considered poor tank country. Allied planners believed it was an unlikely place for a major offensive and treated it as a rest sector. Allied intelligence knew Germany was weakened, but underestimated how many tanks and troops Hitler would risk in one last offensive. Warnings of German buildups were noticed but often dismissed. German soldiers were exhausted and skeptical, yet many still hoped for a miracle. Rumors of a new offensive stirred talk that one decisive strike might change everything, or at least buy time. Belgian and Luxembourg civilians in the Ardennes had already witnessed war. As snow fell, they hoped the front would stay quiet and that no new battles would sweep through their villages. By mid-December 1944, the Ardennes front seemed calm. But beyond the tree line, German units were quietly assembling for one of the largest offensives of the war. Hitler approved a bold plan, a surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes to cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split British and American forces apart. To hide its true purpose, the operation was given the misleading codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Orders stressed secrecy and deception at every level. Panzer divisions with tanks like Panthers and Tigers, along with infantry and artillery, slipped into the forests. They moved mainly at night to avoid Allied aircraft. Fuel was a critical weakness. German planners knew that if they could not capture Allied fuel depots along the way, their spearheads risked stalling before reaching their goals. Some Allied commanders believed German forces could only defend, not attack. With Christmas approaching, many assumed the enemy lacked the strength for a major winter offensive. German planners counted on overcast skies and snow to ground Allied aircraft. If Allied planes could not fly, German columns could move with less fear of being spotted and bombed. German special units in captured uniforms and vehicles planned to infiltrate Allied lines, misdirect traffic, change road signs, and sow confusion behind the front. On the night of December 15-16, German soldiers waited in the woods, cold and anxious. Officers checked watches and maps, reminding them of H-hour and the objectives ahead. Meanwhile, U.S. troops in the Ardennes patrolled, manned listening posts, and tried to stay warm. Many expected a relatively quiet winter sector compared to earlier fighting. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, German artillery suddenly roared to life across the Ardennes, shattering the quiet and announcing that Hitler's last offensive had begun. A massive artillery barrage pounded U.S. positions, cutting phone lines and shocking units that had believed they were in a calm sector. German infantry and tanks moved out behind the barrage, advancing along forest roads and through fog toward lightly held American lines. Many small U.S. outposts and villages were quickly overrun. Some defenders fought briefly before falling back. Others were surrounded in the confusion. Armored spearheads pushed past broken lines, aiming to drive deep into Allied territory before reserves could arrive. The offensive's early hours looked promising from German maps. As American units bent back and German units pushed forward, the front line on Allied maps took on a bowed shape, the bulge that would give the battle its name. At first, Allied headquarters struggled to grasp the scale of the attack. Reports were scattered and sometimes contradictory, but gradually the picture of a major offensive emerged. Despite surprise and being outnumbered, many small U.S. units fought stubbornly at crossroads, bridges and forest edges, buying precious time for reinforcements. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, U.S. units dug in on Elsenborn Ridge and nearby heights, stopping some of the most powerful German formations from breaking through. Ardennes civilians fled their homes or hid in cellars as tanks rolled through villages and shells exploded nearby, unsure which army would control their town next. Even in the first days, destroyed bridges, narrow roads, An unexpected resistance began to slow the German timetable. Some spearheads already lagged behind schedule. The small town of Bastogne sat at a critical road junction. Whoever held it controlled movement through a wide swath of the Ardennes, making it a prime target for both sides. U.S. commanders rushed the 101st Airborne Division and other units into Bastogne, sending paratroopers by truck to dig in before German armor arrived. Soon, German forces surrounded Bastogne, cutting off most roads in and out. The defenders found themselves short on supplies and nearly encircled on all sides. Paratroopers and supporting troops around Bastogne faced freezing temperatures, snow, and shortages of food, ammunition, and winter clothing. The weather was as much an enemy as the shells. German commanders sent a message demanding Bastogne's surrender. They warned of heavy bombardment if the Americans refused. The U.S. commander's written reply to the surrender demand was a single slang word: nuts. It was quickly translated and delivered back, signaling a firm refusal and lifting the defenders' spirits. German forces attacked Bastogne from multiple directions with infantry and tanks. U.S. defenders used anti-tank guns, bazookas, and artillery to hold them off in bitter, close-range battles. As the weather improved, Allied aircraft flew resupply missions over Bastogne, dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies by parachute into the surrounded town. While Bastogne became famous, many other villages and crossroads across the Ardennes saw fierce fighting, where small units on both sides struggled in forests and fields. With Bastogne still holding and other key points resisting, the German offensive began to lose momentum. The window of opportunity for a breakthrough was closing. As the clouds lifted and visibility improved, Allied air forces could once again attack German columns, hitting tanks, trucks, and supply lines exposed on snowy roads. German tanks often had to halt and wait for fuel or be abandoned entirely. Shortages turned powerful armored units into static targets and weakened the offensive. Fresh Allied divisions moved into the Ardennes, reinforcing thin lines and preparing for counterattacks on the shoulders of the Bulge. Inside German headquarters, disagreements grew over where to focus remaining strength: continue pushing west, or shore up flanks under Allied pressure. Conflicting orders added to the chaos. Both sides recognized that small ridges, forests, and crossroads could control entire sectors. Battles raged for seemingly minor patches of ground that had outsized importance. The winter itself became an enemy. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, trench foot, exhaustion, and constant cold that made every task more difficult. Civilians faced destroyed homes, broken roads, and scarce food. Many families were forced into cellars or improvised shelters to survive the fighting around them. As the battle wore on, German losses in men and equipment soared. Panzer divisions bled away tanks they could not replace, and infantry units shrank in strength. Despite the shock of the initial attack, Allied morale stiffened as Bastogne held and German advances slowed. Stories of stubborn resistance encouraged troops across the front. By the end of December, it was clear that the German offensive had failed to meet its goals. The Bulge was still there, but the tide of the battle was turning back in the Allies' favor. U.S. General George Patton pivoted his Third Army northward with remarkable speed, turning from eastward offensives to a new mission: relieve Bastogne and strike the southern flank of the Bulge. The rapid turn required complex logistics. Fuel, ammunition, food, and winter gear had to be rerouted through snow-covered roads to keep the advancing columns supplied. Patton's troops marched and rode through freezing winds and icy paths, pushing themselves to reach comrades in Bastogne as quickly as possible. As Third Army units neared Bastogne, they fought through German defensive belts, clearing roadblocks and pushing back rearguard units. In late December, Patton's forces linked up with the Bastogne garrison. The encirclement was broken, and supplies and reinforcements could flow more reliably into the town. As Allied counterattacks grew stronger, German units began pulling back toward their original positions, trying to avoid being trapped in turn. Some German units conducted fighting withdrawals, holding key crossroads and bridges long enough for comrades to escape, but suffering heavy losses in the process. By late January 1945, the front line looked much like it had before the offensive. The Bulge was pushed back, and the Allies resumed their drive toward the Rhine. The failed offensive cost Germany irreplaceable tanks, vehicles, and experienced troops. Hitler's last major gamble in the West left his armies weaker than ever. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the bloodiest battles for U.S. forces in Europe, and German losses were also severe. Civilians in the Ardennes suffered deeply as their homes became battlefields. Historians later described the Battle of the Bulge as a dramatic late-war surprise that showed how dangerous a cornered enemy can still be. The battle highlighted the importance of careful intelligence analysis, even in quiet sectors, and the danger of assuming an enemy is too weak to act. Commanders studying the Bulge often focus on weather and logistics, showing how fuel, roads, and storms can shape operations as much as armor and artillery. For Ardennes civilians, the Bulge meant another round of occupation, shellfire, and rebuilding. Their experiences remind us that wars are fought in towns and homes as well as on maps. Bastogne became a symbol of stubborn defense, but the battle was made up of many lesser-known stands in nameless forests and crossroads, where courage was just as real. After recovering from the shock of the Bulge, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany. The failed offensive hastened the collapse of the Third Reich. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge remembered frozen foxholes, sudden firefights, and the bonds between comrades that helped them endure one of the hardest winters of the war. Today, monuments, cemeteries, and preserved foxholes in Belgium and Luxembourg honor soldiers and civilians who lived through the winter of 1944-45. Our tiny storytellers remind us that the Battle of the Bulge was both a desperate gamble and a test of endurance. By studying it, we see how planning, weather, leadership, and ordinary courage all combine to shape history.